from the Asian confluence on this very interesting conversation as part of our conversation series, the ASCON NADI conversations. Today, we are here to talk about a very unique subject, culture meets hydrodiplomacy, with two experts and academics who hail from two spectrums, one from the field of culture and the other from hydrodiplomacy. I'm honored and pleased to welcome Professor Jamil Ahmed, Professor, Department of Theatre and Performance Studies, University of Dhaka, Bangladesh, and Dr. Medha Bisht, a Senior Assistant Professor at the Department of International Relations, South Asian University, New Delhi, India. A warm welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thank you.
In the Asian confluence, we view our sub-region as one of shared waters and shared ideas. And we see our rivers, which are called NADI in our language, NADIs, that really binds us as an expression of these shared waters in one shared destiny. The word NADI can also have another pronunciation, NADI. NADI means the nadis of energy, which are the conduits of energy that flow through our body and keep us alive. And it is with this thought that just as the nadis keep us alive, so too our waters, which run through our land and our shared geography, keep us all alive, keep our cultures alive, and sustain us. The Asian Confluence NADI platform therefore views our shared waters as lifelines that keep our peoples, their livelihoods, and culture alive. Naturally, therefore, water and its management, its governance, is a core component of the relationships between the nations that are in our region and share these waters. Therefore, in today's discussion, culture meets hydrodiplomacy, where we have so much of is very timely because we have so many issues around the issue of water and its governance, freshwater security, and this topic of culture meets hydrodiplomacy is, I think, a very, very timely conversation to have, especially in the times that we live in today. But the word diplomacy often is kept in the realm of the diplomats or the government or the state. And therefore, today I would like to start off this discussion with this question that, and I'll direct this question to Dr. Medha Bisht to start with. Can you give us your perspective as to what really is hydrodiplomacy? What do we mean by this word?
Thank you, Mr. Datta. I think it's really a pleasure being here because I'm very happy that you are, in fact, facilitating this whole conversation on culture and hydrodiplomacy, which I think is a very important theme, which unfortunately does not really get addressed. And I'm particularly also happy that it's getting channelized, it's getting voiced through Asian Confluence, which I would say is one of the forefront organizations in looking at culture issues in South Asia. So thank you for that. Now to come specifically to your question on what is hydrodiplomacy. I would say that there are two qualifying words here. Hydro, which means water, and diplomacy is something that I would want to dwell on today, because most of the time when we're talking about transboundary water politics, water diplomacy is an often used word. And as you rightly put out, diplomacy is often associated with state-based engagement. So, to give this a perspective, give this conversation a perspective, perhaps I would like to dwell a bit on the term diplomacy itself. Now, interestingly, if you look at the word diplomacy, it primarily means encountering the other. And this other, has a very different identity, which means this actor with a different identity in an encounter, supposedly can be termed as, say, an enemy, or a stranger, a foreigner, or I would say even an alien. And the task of diplomacy really is to take this encounter forward. And how does it really take this encounter forward? It takes this encounter between two actors with very different identities forward by offering certain mitigating mechanisms or mediating mechanisms. So diplomacy essentially is not about the use of force, but it's about these encounters, and how to, in fact, take these encounters forward. Therefore, I would say in diplomacy studies, what we essentially do is that we study practices which, in fact, inform these diplomatic encounters. And I would say that, there are two important practices that I would want to draw your attention to. The first is communication. Now, communication is both verbal and non-verbal, and negotiation. And negotiation, we know, is an art of diplomacy. It's a specialized skill. One thing which, to my mind, is very important when we're talking about negotiation is that it has a particular political objective to achieve. And therefore, the negotiators or the actors in here really try to use various means or various stratagems to achieve their political objective. Now, to begin with, as to why I thought to foreground this distinction between communication and negotiation is because most often when we see this discourse on water diplomacy is overwhelmingly focused on negotiation. And fair enough, why not? But at the cost of communication. And I think particularly when we are talking about the South Asian context, this differentiation between communication and negotiation needs to be highlighted. Because if you look at our own South Asian traditions, our own South Asian intellectual legacies, much of it is not really on negotiations, but it is on communication. It's on the genres of dialogue. So for instance, a text like Arthashastra also, speaks about non-verbal communication, particularly the upayas that it's talking about, or even the Shatagunyas, the 6 methods of foreign policy it's talking about, primarily non-verbal communication. Also, if you look at the dialogic genres, starting from Rig Veda to, I think, the Upanishads, or even to that matter of fact, to the Jatakas, there is a lot of dialogic variety that one is familiarized with. And I think when we are really talking about diplomacy or diplomatic practices, these aspects of communication become important. And I think we need to go back to our own intellectual traditions because South Asia is very rich with them. And this I find very interesting because, South Asia is culturally rich, it's diverse, and there was a lot of emphasis on mediating differences. In that context, I think, culture becomes a very exciting site to understand, because the question which then comes to mind is that can culture become a mitigating mechanism, a communicative mechanism to take diplomacy forward. And it is here, I would say, that culture primarily meets hydrodiplomacy. And I would, in fact, now turn on to Professor Ahmed, if I may, and I would ask, and I would like to ask him that, what are the ways in your mind, what are the ways through which conceptions or concepts like culture and community could inform the field of hydrodiplomacy? How can culture or community, I would say, become mitigating mechanisms for hydrodiplomacy or diplomacy? Over to you, Professor Ahmed.
Thank you very much. And thank you, of course, Asian Conference, for inviting me. It's a wonderful opportunity to share ideas. Dr. Bisht has already spoken of water diplomacy. I don't want to go into that, but what I want to highlight here is very briefly is that cultural tools as artistic performance can be key to moving beyond state-centric diplomacy, which is very important. And I think we'll be getting back to this again and again, which remains trapped in state-centric framework and often focusing on distributive bargaining strategies. Now, as Dr. Bisht has already pointed out, what is happening here is diplomacy well, the parameter of diplomacy is encountering the other. And then, of course, and mitigating the difference. It is this other that becomes very important. And here, I think the way culture meeting hydrodiplomacy would want to negotiate the terms of what really culture means, and how do you define, or how do you understand, how do you conceptualize community, this other that you are encountering in diplomacy. So here, what I want to go on to is this. If you listen to this song, or this is what I mean by culture. I'm having a technical issue here. Okay, right. Sorry. Listen to this or see this dance if it makes sense.
कभी शाम बहे कभी रुद्र पल पल एक नया चित्र ओ जिंदगी की सिखा यूं ही बहना तू है सृष्टि ब्रह्मा तेरे पिता.
So both the examples, the dance and the song to Bhatti Ali by Abbasuddin, you have a prominent featuring of symbols. And this is what, again, Clifford Geertz is talking about when he explicates culture. Historically transmitted pattern of meaning embodied in symbols. A system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms. So both the dance and the song, they're symbolic forms. And through that, inherited conceptions are expressed and historically transmitted patterns of embodied symbols. So, and important symbols on both the dance and the song are river. By means of these symbols, humans communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge and attitude towards life. And that's important about culture. Symbols are any object, act, event, quality, or relation which serves as a vehicle for a conception. Here, the conception is a symbol's meaning. Now, I go by Geertz to make it very clear, or to make sense of what really culture is, beyond what it is usually taken to be in the diplomatic circles as cosmetic tools that you look at after the hard bargaining, you relax, you to smile in the evening, and then you go back to hard bargaining. So culture is really a kind of soft diplomatic package. But I insist that it is much more than that. And by more than that, I would like you to see how this song makes sense or makes meaning, this symbolic form. If you look at this song.
শোনায় হয়তো সম্প্রতি শালিখের বেশে আবার আসিব ফিরে স্মৃতির তীরে এই বাংলা.
Many of you must, I'm sure you'll realize that you know that this is a very famous song by Jivanananda Das, a poem where he's speaking of Dhanshiri river, again a river, and what the river means. But look at this also to see how culture, here a symbolic form, the song contextualized with the two images makes sense, or you can make meaning of culture speaks of.
ভাটির গাং বাইয়া আমার ভাই ধন রে কয় নায়র নিত বইলা তোরা কে যাস কে যাস রে ভাটির গাং বাইয়া আমার ভাই ধন রে কয় নায়র নিত বইলা তোরা কে যাস বছর খানি ঘুইরা গেল রে ভাইয়ের দেখা পাইলাম না.
Okay, so this song too is it is again culture because it has historically transmitted pattern of meaning. It's symbolic because it conveys something. Traditionally or usually it conveys the meaning of a wife waiting to be taken back to her parents' house. And this is the historical context of meaning. But juxtapose with these images that you have here, it tells a very different story, and that is how I think culture makes meaning. Here, of course, on top right, you have a woman dead, and in the bottom, you have women homeless. So here, the song waiting for the brother to come and take them back to their parents' house has an entirely different sort of meaning. That being culture, Anthony P. Cohen explicates the notion of community differently. And this is important because community, when we are talking of community, when you're talking of the nation state, this is another community, a larger community. Now, usually community is explicated as structural. Community is explicated as in terms of structures, statistics, and even demographics. But then Cohen, and this is what Cohen is important, is speaking of community as a relational idea, which simultaneously implies both similarity and difference. And this is where it is different from diplomacy, where it is encountering the other. But community, this notion of community, it can simultaneously, because it can be symbolic, it can imply both similarity and difference. It is more than geographical and sociological facts, exists in the minds of its members, and that's very important. It is not structural, it's not how these people live, eat, die, or do say their prayers or address their divinities or the statistics, but it is in the minds, how the people to conceive of community in the minds. The distinctiveness of communities and thus the reality of their boundaries lie in the mind of the people, the meanings which people attach to them, not in the structural forms. And therefore, culture and community can work together to reformulate, to redefine this other that diplomacy speaks of. Culture of the community does not generate out of the social structure or the doing of the social behavior, but as Cohen insists, culture lives in how the community thinks about itself. It is the sense of the community that may be understood as a symbolic rather than structural construct. And by this, I mean, listen to this song to understand, to see what sense of community this song generates.
सारे जहां से अच्छा दोस्ता हमारा, हम बुलबुले हैं इसकी, ये गुलसिता हमारा. हमारा सारे जहां से अच्छा हम रहता है दिल वतन में समझो वही हमें भी दिल हो जहां हमारा हमारा.
This song generates, what this song is doing is that it generates this notion of community in the minds of the people. Again, listen to this song, another song that I have for you here, and then I will end.
ধনো ধান্য পুষ্প ভরা আমাদের এই বসুন্ধরা আহার মাঝে আছে দেশে
সকল দেশে সেরা
ও সে স্বপ্ন দিয়ে তৈরি সে দেশ
স্মৃতি দিয়ে ঘেরা চন্দ্র সূর্য গ্রহ তারা কোথায় উজ্জ্বল এমন ধারা
কোথায় এমন খেলি তোড়ি
এমন কালো মেঘে
তারা পাখি ডাকে ঘুমিয়ে পড়ে
পাখি ডাকে জেগে
I will stop here to end with this notion that both these songs, Dhano Dhanne Pushpe Bhara and Sare Jahan Se Acha, they create this notion of community symbolically in the mind. And that is not rigid, that is flexible, fluid, and that encourages people to participate. Consider, for example, Sare Jahan Se Acha when played by a military band in India, with all the armed forces marching past in a very martial manner. Contrasted to that, this song, the song that I play, creates a very different notion of community. And that is what culture can do, signify community in the minds of the people. Yeah, and that's what I would have to say.
Thank you so much, Professor Jamil. That was so wonderful, so beautiful. And when I was listening to the song Dhanno Dhanne Pushpe Bhara, it kind of, as a Bengali, it raises your it raises your hair really, and you feel that you're one with the waters and the land, and we are so indivisible, and we are one people together, and in that context I want to ask both of you, in what ways can this understanding of culture and community help address some of the difficult issues that we face today related to water and overall in the geopolitics in South Asia today? It's a question to Professor Jamil first, maybe, and then to Dr. Medha, Bisht, or whichever in order which you would like to take it.
I think Dr. Bisht, you start off. I'll wind up.
So thank you for that. I think, the visuals were really interesting because it took me back to my own training in diplomacy studies, where, it is said that diplomacy is not just about negotiating interests and positions. It's also about negotiating certain meanings, certain belief systems. And it's interesting, how we look at culture and how we make culture interact with diplomacy. I think, there is much work which needs to be done on this. But to come to your extremely significant question, and I think, this question would be there in the minds of many listeners or people, who would think of establishing a conversation between culture and higher diplomacy, is that what do we do of the South Asian geopolitics? And to that, I would, in fact, since I'm a person of definitional clarity, I would like to say one thing before I begin with, and that is that when you really invoke the term geopolitics, I think it's very important to contrast, diplomacy first with foreign policy, and secondly with statecraft. This is because most of the time when we are talking about diplomacy, we are interchangeably using it either for foreign policy or either for statecraft. So, for instance, if you look at statecraft as a term, and I think these definitional nuances are very important because diplomacy is a much more creative subject, and we shouldn't really bind it, to the way we look at perhaps engagement between actors. But when you look at, I would say, statecraft, statecraft is primarily an engagement between actors. And if you look at contemporary water diplomacy or water politics in South Asia, much of it is water statecraft. And this water statecraft has a huge colonial legacy behind it. So one needs to keep that in mind. Secondly, when one really comes to the issue of foreign policy is a much more broader term. I would say it's essentially about the principles and the interests of the state. And diplomacy is essentially an implementing arm of foreign policy, where the task of the diplomat is to make the policies of a host state intelligible to other actors. Having given this definition and going back to the original sort of definition which I had started with in terms of diplomacy, I think when one juxtaposes water diplomacy with the geopolitics, the question becomes important. And the question then we need to ask is that, how do practices such as communication and negotiation, because these are practices we study as students of diplomacy, how do practices such as communication and negotiation transform the interest and the position of state actors? And I think this is the question which the student of diplomacy would essentially work on. And then you look at these practices, you have to also look at the relationship between power and diplomacy. What is the relationship between power and diplomacy? I think it becomes very important, particularly as we speak, from South Asia and on South Asia. So I would say that there are two types of power. The first type of power is hard power, where essentially you are trying to use coercive diplomacy. It's primarily about hard bargaining strategies. Professor Ahmed was just talking about distributive bargaining. Use of force is an open option, but as the last option, primarily to deter a particular actor, not necessarily that you use force. Secondly, when you look at soft power, and this is something which I think we've not really looked at in South Asia. If we have, as Professor Ahmed says, we primarily looked in a very cosmetic way. And when we are talking about soft power here, I think the question for us becomes that how do we in fact leverage culture to create a shared understanding between actors. And I think, this needs a very conscious understanding. We need to think about this question, deliberate on this question in a very conscious manner, because if we do not do that, the dominant narrative of hard power is going to be prominent in South Asia. And I say this primarily given the geopolitical realities or geopolitical complexities that South Asia is embedded in. So if you look at the rivers which flow, they primarily flow through the border regions. Some of these rivers are border creating rivers. The nature of South Asian rivers is that they shift. Many of the rivers have shifted in the past few decades. Some of the rivers actually flow to disputed areas, and not only disputed areas, but some volatile areas where there is internal dissent or which are conflict zones in particular. And because of this, what happens? The water discourse in South Asia primarily becomes securitized and very politicized. Another aspect, I would say, the nature of water engagement in South Asia is that it has a huge colonial legacy. and where most of the post-colonial states in South Asia have a high element or a modicum of riparian mistrust or distrust against each other. So this is one reality of South Asian water politics, and much of the work has been done on it. But there is another reality, and that's something which we need to also talk of, because this is the reality stemming from the ground. Now, when you really go to the field, or you really go to these borderlands, you see that the border regions which actually inhabit, or the border districts which actually inhabit the South Asian space, most of the people have similar problems. Either they are facing ecological degradation, landslides, floods, soil degradation, agricultural degradation. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that they have a shared destiny when it really comes to water issues. Also, another reality of the water in South Asia is that the flow of water, the trajectory that it follows, really flows through regions which have a very distinct cultural uniqueness, associated with them. And that is perhaps why we're talking about culture here, the cultural richness which actually lies, along the borderlands. And it is here, perhaps I would say, that South Asia really thrives. The idea of South Asia really thrives in these border regions. It does not really thrive when capitals in particular countries are really speaking to each other. And one of the peculiarities, I would say, of the South Asian rivers is that, as they flow from the Himalayas, down to the Bay of Bengal, to the ocean, they ecologically integrate, South Asia. And I think, this becomes extremely important. And the question for us, therefore, is that how do we reconcile, and coming to your question of geopolitics, how do we reconcile the geopolitical imagination with South Asia with an ecological sensibility? When we are trying to talk about water in South Asia, the question for me as a student of diplomacy again becomes, how do we represent water so that it can actually give shape to a larger group identity? I think that's a very important question again. And, how does this ecological imagination or this ecological identity give or translate meaning or give meaning to the geopolitical understanding of South Asia? So we're talking about two selves which South Asia itself has. It has an ecological self, it has a cultural self, and it has a geopolitical self. And I think as students of politics, as students of diplomacy which is a mediating mechanism, a key question is that how do we reconcile these competing imaginations, and how do we reconcile the geopolitical notion of I would say, the post-colonial South Asia, which is marked by states which are grounded in the national identity, where sovereignty primarily reigns high. So this is what I have to say. When we are talking about geopolitics and water politics, it's not really an easy question, but when we are getting in the element of water diplomacy, I think these questions need some addresses. And I think culture, again, could have some particularly interesting answers to offer. If Professor Ahmed, would like to step in here, and perhaps he could talk of, the ways through which some of these challenges, in South Asia, geopolitical challenges in South Asia can be mitigated through intercultural communication, since he's been talking a lot on meaning making. Over to you, Professor Ahmed.
Thank you, Dr. Bisht. I think when you raise this question about how to reconcile competing notions in these narratives of the nation states, the most problematic area that I have in mind, that I find, is the nation state itself. And going by, say, the Marxist explication of the nation state or the state itself, it is controlled by interests, elite interests at the topmost level of the elite of the elites of the classes who have and it does not really take into consideration the interests of the people at the ground level. Now, but then intercultural communication is what we need here, which can perhaps, the problem that we have here is the nation state. And let me explain why and how. By intercultural communication, I mean, of course, intermeaning between, among, or in the midst of, mutually, together, or during. And culture, as I have already said, is a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms, by means of which humans communicate. Now, communication from Latin communicare means to share. The act of conveying meaning from one group to another through the use of mutually understood signs and symbols. Often what happens is that the nation's interest or the nation state's interest comes forward. And I don't think this communication, meaning sharing of conveying meaning from one group to the other, that takes place taking into consideration the interest of the people living in ground zero level. The communication, intercultural communication seeks communication between cultures, the bearers of cultures, and symbolic forms are devised to facilitate containment and resolution of conflict across strife-driven communities. But now listen to this song and see if this is really intercultural communication. Now, I take you to this imagined scenario of Farakka barrage, and you're sitting on the Indian side, you're sitting on the Bangladeshi side, and you're looking at what you the black and white image on top right, and you're listening to this song. This is exactly what is not happening here, what the song says. So the contrast brings up something else. But imagine listening to this song on the other side of the border, where you have the dignitaries, and you listen to this, the same song. But now you're looking at the image down left. This is exactly not intercultural communication, and this is exactly where the nation invisibly is interceding. But again, look at this. Look at this. I mean, if you're in the Bangladesh side, or although the same Farakka barrage, or even Tista barrage, and then if you're listening to this song. Rabindranath's play or the song would do little in terms of intercultural communication here. These symbolic forms do little because they do not facilitate the containment and resolution of conflicts. Because these projects, the view of a particular is important. The boundary marks the beginning and end of a community. Boundary is necessary because it encapsulates the community's identity. Now, some boundaries, such as the boundary of the nations, may be statutory, may be physical, or may be racial, cultural, or religious. But all the components of any boundary are not so apparent because the reality of the boundary lies in the mind. This is particularly pertinent when the community is a nation, when you're talking of a nation. And the previous two songs really highlight how the nation invisibly intercedes. This notion of the nation is the most problematic challenge in hydro diplomacy, and I would pause it. But then listen to this song and see if it makes a different kind of sense.
Keshwari Hasin Shahbaz, Tu Nishane Azme Alishan Arze Pakistan, Markaze Yaqeen Shahbaz, Pak se Zameen ka nizam, Quvvate Quvvate Saltanat, Painda Tabinda Ba, Shahbaz Manzil-e-Murad,
जमे सितारों हिला रहबर तरक्कियों कमाल
तर्जमाने माज़ी शाने हाल जाने इस्तक़बाल
साया खुदा
अधिनायक जया हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा
द्राविड़ उत्कल गंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्छल जलति तरंगा तव शुभ नाम जागे
तव शुभ आशीष मांगे.
I have been, before 1971, when I was a child, I was as a student, we'd sing Pak Sar Zameen, and it never made any sense to me. And during the Liberation War, I was a freedom fighter, and I hated this song. We all hated this song. But you know, listening to this song, I'm not a citizen of either Pakistan or India, but when I listen to this song, sung by singers of both the states, both the nations, and singing alternatively, it makes a huge notion of, I mean, it really dissolves this idea of this boundary between these states, even for me, and as does this song.
বিস্তীর্ণ পাররে অহংখ্য জনরে হাহাকার শুনিও নিশব্দে নীরবে বুঢ়ালুই তুমি বুঢ়ালুই গোৱা কিয়.
So here, what is important for me is this notion of class instead of, you know, a nation. So then that class belongs to both across the national boundaries. And that is why I think the notion of the nation is so problematic here. Academics and leaders of political parties especially speak of origins of a nation with certainty. They're so certain that India was created millions of years ago, perhaps, Pakistan, America, or any other state, and invariably they'll claim to a legacy of thousands of years. But the boundary of the nation is demarcated out of difference of value systems. It can be ethnic, common heritage, a common culture, shared language, common ancestry, or religion or race, or civic, as in the United States. It can be political rights or procedures. But these are not original and definitional characteristics. That's important. These are social identifiers, which are the result of the product of struggles on both sides of the boundary. And an excellent example is India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. When Pakistan was created, religion was the prime marker for Pakistan. And India, when I studied there from 75 to 79, it was a wonderful place that embraced difference. It was an embraced common culture. But now look at the way India is shifting back to this no sign of religion as the marker of national identity. So again, the point is here, not that who is right or who is wrong, but then none of these definitional characteristics are original. They are identifiers and result and product of struggles on both sides. The notion of the nation importantly emerged with American Declaration of Independence and the French Revolution 1789. So it was the end of 18th century when this notion of the nation emerged. And in South Asia, it was borrowed from the West and applied for the first time in the 19th century. Before that, people did not think in terms of nation. And that's important. Now, Renan and Rabindranath, they all explicate, Rabindranath takes off from Renan to explicate what a nation is. A nation is a soul, a spiritual principle. Two things that are really important that constitute the soul of the spiritual principle. One is the past, how you invoke the past. The other is the present. It is the past, it invokes a common trove of memories. And the present is the actual consent, the desire to live together, and the continued value of the undivided, that we share heritage. So to have had glorious moments in common in the past, that also creates a nation, and also for the present that we agree, that we have this consent that yes, we the people want to live together. That both of these create this notion of the nation. But again, Rabindranath, as taking off from Renaud, later on comments, the nation is the greatest evil of the nation. And I completely agree with him here. Intercultural communication are not performances devised to facilitate containment and resolution of conflicts, I would say, but rather intercultural communication are performances devised to generate dialogue across strife-ridden communities. And with that, I hand it back to you, Dr. Bisht, or Mr. Datta, if you want to proceed from there.
Yeah, thank you so much to both of you. I think there are several takeaways, and Dr. Bisht said that South Asia really resides in the borders. I couldn't agree more. And our notion and your you know what you alluded to Tagore and Renaud. I just want to put that in the context of in the next question. What I thought of was that South Asia is the least integrated if we look at it economically, even if we look at it, in our current system of trade or economics. But we are totally integrated if we look at our rivers. We are one ecological entity. What we in Asian Conference call it a mountain to sea entity, basically. And what really is the meaning of these rivers? I mean, many of the borders are made by the rivers, and some of the borders are flowing boundaries. They are really changing all the time. They create a lot of issues from time to time. And here, can we refer my question? There are two questions I have, I guess. One is, what is the real meaning of rivers in our context, as our shared waters, as embodying our shared waters, our shared destiny, our shared present, and our shared future? And can we go back to the wisdom of the great poets? You talked about Rabindranath Tagore, Lalan, Nazrul, some of the songs that you alluded to, Bhupen Hazarika's, some of the songs. What are the takeaways from that? Can you both comment a bit on that aspect?
Would you like me to start, or Dr.
Yes.
Bisht, would you like to go ahead? You want me to start? Okay.
Sorry,
right.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, all right. What I have to say in response to your question is, the symbolic value of river in the entire Ganges, Brahmaputra, Meghna basin. I begin with Subhash Mukhopadhyay. You may be familiar with this, and I have this translation here also, Jete Jete. Listen to this.
তারপর যেতে 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 এক নদীর সঙ্গে দেখা, পায়ে তার ঘুঙুর বাঁধা, পরনে উড়ু উড়ু ঢেউয়ের নীল ঘাগরা। সে নদীর দুদিকে দুটো মুখ, এক মুখে সে আমাকে আসছি বলে দাঁড় করিয়ে রেখে অন্য মুখে ছুটতে ছুটতে চলে গেল।
This is what river means to us. Again, from Qazi Nazrul Islam. Listen to this song.
কুল ভাঙে পুকুর গড়ে, এই তো নদীর খেলা। সকাল বেলা আমি ফকির সন্ধ্যা বেলা রে ভাই ফকির সন্ধ্যা বেলা এই তো নদীর খেলা।
Another aspect is Manusha Mongol. This is hugely important for entire Bengal, West Bengal, Bangladesh, and Assam, and the areas region, the adjoining region. Manusha Mongol, and the image that I am showing you is here, Manusha Pot, which is a traditional performance with scroll painting. And Manusha Mongol has been continuing since the 15th century, really, early 15th century, and is still performed all over the region. And we have, at our department at the University of Dhaka, we performed, shall we say, the current meaning, revise the current meaning of what this text says. But then river features very importantly here. Or listen to this. This is a Bhati Ali song written by Ukil Munshi, but sung by Bari Siddiqui. In most of the songs, you have this, on many of the songs, you have this pain, the pain that is that the people usually associate with the rivers. But this is a pain of a different sort. The song that I am playing now, a Bhavaya song, and it is again personal pain, pain of love. This is Tista River, of course. The nation is absolutely missing in this song. And what features is again gender, sexuality, and love. So these are the areas we can look into. And listen to this song by Farida Parveen, taking off from Lalan Fakir.
Nodi kimba dil baud khal সর্বস্থলে একই এক জল নদী কিংবা বিল বাওড় খাল সর্বস্থলে একই এক জল একা মেরে সাই ফেরে সর্বঠাই একা মেরে সাই ফেরে সর্বঠাই মানুষে মিশিয়া হয় বিধান তার মানুষ মানুষ গুরু নিষ্ঠা যার ভবে মানুষ গুরু নিষ্ঠা যার
So this is different. This is what river does for this entire region, and this is how we conceive of the river. But and I would like to end my explication with Tagore's Gitanjali, this poem 69, Stream of Life. So briefly, in multiple ways that the people of this region have conceived of the river and what it means. In all the songs and the performances that I've played, the nation doesn't intervene here to make sense or make meaning of how we understand our life. And that is what culture is about, actually. Over to you, Dr. Bisht.
Thank you, Professor Ahmed. I think, as again a student of that's fine. So, as a student of international relations, the river, in fact, teaches me many things. It inspires me to really look at the world, understand the world in different ways. For me, the first thing when someone utters the river, or when I look at the river, and the more I've read about rivers, is really the interconnectedness of life. And I think it's here that this becomes really the entry point for us to really look at going back to my whole question of South Asian legacy, of dependent origination. Because if you look at South Asian philosophical thinking, philosophical legacy, there is a lot to offer, which we need to discover. And I'm not really saying this in terms of, just on the matter of a rhetoric, but I think it is really important in terms of knowledge production essentially to the discipline of international relations. Because when you look at diplomacy, diplomacy to me is a social practice. It is a relational practice. And in fact, when you are really trying to understand the engagement between actors, interaction between actors, it's really this transformation of identity and interests, which play a very important role. So for instance, how Rabindranath Tagore perhaps would inspire me as a student of diplomacy. I know it's very difficult to get Tagore in when we're talking about diplomacy. But I think if you look at the intellectual inspiration of Tagore, his intellectual inspiration primarily goes back to the Bhakti tradition. It goes back, I would say, to the Upanishads. And one of the things that Tagore sort of celebrates is the human spirit. And that human spirit is something very important, amongst all the Bhakti saints, which in fact are the Sufi saints, which came in during that point of time. And one of the essential, and the way I take lessons from it, particularly from the communication point of view, is, and there is where dialogue, communication becomes important, is that, while most of these people, recognize differences, so, acknowledging differences is very important. And I think South Asian space has always done that. But they've also offered views, to transgress those differences. And it is here that, I would say that going back to the idea of knowledge production, becomes important. Because when, as a student, say we look at the discipline of international relations, and I'm getting into a bit of theory right now, we know that the discipline of international relations is primarily ethnocentric. It primarily sort of emerged. It's a product or a consequence of Western experiences. Some of the theories that we have, realism, liberalism, they primarily come in from the Western philosophical thought. And I think, that's very important because that's very important to address. Because now when you look at this discourse of non-Western international relations theory or global international relations theory, the whole focus is on the different ways of looking at world. And if you really go back to what does the South Asian philosophy has to tell us about theorizing the political, the political is not very separate. The political is interdependent on each other. And I guess that was the reason why Tagore was very against this whole notion of nation state. Because this notion of nation state, made one, worship this mechanistic concept of the nation state, at the cost of the individual who's right in front of you. So I think, when we look at our own traditions, and even if we look at the understanding of political, say before the Westphalian period, before 1648, when the idea of nation state came in, there was a lot of thought, philosophical thought, political thought. And I think one really needs to engage with this in terms of really moving beyond, I would say, the idea of nation state, which Professor Ahmed was just talking about. So that's what I have to say in terms of the intellectual inspiration that one really gets, not only to praxis, towards the practice of water politics, but also the theory of a discipline, to the knowledge production of a particular discipline per se. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you both of you for such a wonderful interpretation, and it was very, very enriching. I think we are coming to the end of our discussion, but I would like to ask you a question, which I'm sure haunts us all, which is, what is the way forward? And I want to address this question to both of you. How do you think, in what ways can culture really meet hydrodiplomacy in these times? And over to you, Professor Bisht and Professor Jamil.
So thank you for that question, because I think this is a very important question, because it really gives a backdrop to where these ideas are coming from. And I think it's really nice to have this platform actually speak on that. Now, as I said, one needs to really look at the traditions of dialogue, the traditions of communication going back to the South Asian legacy. And it's very important because while there is a lot of talk on negotiations, we hardly talk about communication. And given the difficult context, of South Asia, geopolitical context of South Asia, I think communication should precede, negotiation. In fact, if you look at the debates on water governance today, if you look at the evolution of water studies, the evolution of water studies has in fact made a giant leap. And the present debates on transboundary water governance, primarily are inspired, I would say, many, but then two I would like to speak on, is the IWRM perspective. And this IWRM perspective is primarily talking about the ecosystems perspective, where it's talking about that need not really look water, in sectoral terms, but when you're really talking about the water, it's not just the surface water which is flowing along the river, but it's essentially the biodiversity, it's essentially the soil, it's the entire ecosystem. And the other perspective, which I think becomes again very important, is the water energy food nexus. And the water energy food nexus, again, when it's talking about water security, across transboundary rivers, it's primarily talking about an integrated, holistic understanding of water, where we need to, in fact, take water not in a compartmentalized zone, but in fact redefine water or give meaning to water in terms of the energy or in terms of the food. And I think this broadened understanding of water, holistic ways of looking at ecology, eco-hydrology, becomes very important. And it's here that South Asian tradition again, sort of appeals to me, because it's primarily talking about this interdependence. Tagore appeals to me because he's primarily talking about this interdependence. In fact, Arthashastra, also a text of classic statecraft, is primarily talking about this network-based approach. It's talking about this interdependence. So that's one, which I thought that why this talk on culture and hydro diplomacy is very relevant, not only to the discourse, but also to our own legacies. The second thing, I feel when we're talking about the community is again, really coming up, in the debates these days. And primarily this process, I would say, started post 1992, where there was a lot of focus on stakeholder participation, primarily the Rio Conference 1992. And since then, there has been a lot of focus on the participation of the people. And one thing which in fact came to my mind while Professor Ahmed was speaking, that when you're really talking about the community participation, I think culture really becomes that communicative medium to mobilize the community, which I think is so very important. And lastly, I would say, we cannot, in fact, finish or end this debate without really taking into account this whole notion of sustainable development goals, because the whole notion of SDGs is about integrated, holistic ways of looking at water. It's not about arithmetic hydrology. And I say, this is important because most of the water debates are actually, trapped into that. Sustainable development and water, is essentially about looking at water in holistic terms, where essentially you're not just looking at water in quantitative terms, but you're essentially looking at water in quality terms. You're talking about access to clean and safe drinking water. Also, when you're talking about, I would say, food security, I think gone are the days now. We are beyond this whole discourse on food security. We are talking about nutrition security. So, once you look at these new debates coming up, I think one needs to invert the lenses, change the lenses in terms of looking at water diplomacy. And I would say, deconstructing both diplomacy and both water, becomes important to really kickstart the debate, so that the real stakeholders in the process are not really the political actors, but I would say the social actors too, because it is through this process only that the ownership of rivers, or this whole notion of facilitating a dialogue can in fact go further. So that's what I have to say in terms of my finishing remarks. Over to you, Professor Ahmed.
Right, thank you. I take note of two very important points that you've raised, Dr. Bisht, and these are first, this tradition of dialogue and the stakeholders who need to be really taken in by stakeholders. I mean not our politicians, but the people who live in that area and the people who really have to struggle in manners that they do because of water. Now, in terms of strategies for intercultural communication that I would suggest are these. I would stress that most importantly, bypass the construct of the nation by deploying non-state actors. Now, I know this may sound radical, but I think my position here is radical, that we really need to bypass this construct of the nation. And here, if you can deploy non-state actors by emphasizing one of the multiple identities that two strife-ridden communities may be marked and bounded by. Say across the border, when you're talking of the Tista River, it may be a common heritage. We can stress a common culture. We can stress a common shared language. We can stress a common ancestry or shared geopolitical characteristics or gender. Like the song on Tista River was speaking of a woman speaking of love, and that communicates across the border. So by emphasizing one of the multiple identities, if non-state actors can engage into intercultural communication by, say, deploying culture as symbolic forms. These forms should rewrite symbolically and adaptly the notion of community, what community is, and that exists in the minds of its constituent members as a mental construct. So if you can rewrite that, the notion of the community as it exists across the border when we're talking of Tista, say, for example, or across the border when you're talking of Ganges and Padda, for example, in a manner that the members' social perception of similarities and difference accommodate plurality and multivocality, and that's important. It should not be, the way we construct intercultural communication should not be like Bipulo Tarango Hai, as I demonstrated earlier, that in a manner that it evokes both similarity and differences, and in a manner that they accommodate similarities and differences accommodate plurality. and multivocality. The manner when you heard the song on Bangladesh, the singers in Bangladesh singing a song about Bengal, and when you say that it really touches you, then it touches across the border, and that's where this notion of the nation is bypassed. Because symbols do not only stand for other things, but they also represent the other things ambiguously. It is not hard and fast. So Bengal evoked, or the NADI moan evoked, or the woman's mind evoked in those songs were not, or even say, Sare Jahan Se Acha, Hindustan. Hindustan here evoked bypasses rigid constructs by representing Hindustan or Bengal ambiguously, and which allows for multivocality, allows for accommodation of plurality. And symbols allow their common form to be retained and shared among members of a group, but do not impose uniform meaning. So Pak Saur Zameen Saad Baad, when sung across the border, they really retain their common form, but signify differently because the singers are singing across the border. And as for the notion of dialogue that you raised, Dr. Bisht, I think here Paulo Freire is very important. Dialogue is not just speaking across the table, and that's sham dialogue, but dialogue is encounter between men, human beings. Here I'm quoting Freire, an encounter between humans mediated by the world in order to name the world. By that I mean in order to understand the world. Naming the world means application of critical faculty to question any authority of knowledge as the given truth, be that the Quran, be that the Prime Minister of India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh, or be that anybody, any apostle of truth. This is not the final authority of truth. To lean on an unveiling of misrecognized mechanics. So you unveil misrecognized of mechanics in dialogue of an existing statutory condition produced by the mechanics of power. So when you're talking of teach the river sharing, you're really, we need to unveil the misrecognized mechanics of that exist. And you need to come across and not kind of exert what you want. Now, in a manner that the unveiling in turn appears to the namers as a new problem that requires new naming. And no dialogue will end in a kind of, a confluence of complete understanding. They'll create new problems, and you again engage in dialogue for new naming and new envisioning of your reality or what you understand. So dialogue is an act of creation. It cannot exist without humility. It's very important. And you do not engage in dialogue without humility. It cannot exist in the absence of profound love for the world, for the humans, and does not serve as a crafty instrument for domination. So that cannot be dialogue, where dialogue or apparent dialogue, sham dialogue, is actually serving crafty instrument for domination only. Now, what I propose is a dialogic performance, and this proposal should engage the artistic performance, should create an artistic performance for dialogic encounter, and should begin separately across two antagonistic communities, across this river border in Bangladesh and in India, where in each of the communities in India and Bangladesh, you have a group of non-state multidisciplinary investigators drawn from, say, sociology, anthropology, but not limited to political science, economics, history, folklore, hydrology, ecology, environmental science, and more if you wish. And with them also a group of skilled performers. They are to take up the process of devising two symbolic forms and engage both the communities across the international boundary into dialogue. Each group should be accepted, importantly, by the insiders of the respective community. So the group chosen for India should be chosen by those people in North Bengal as their insiders, and also same applies in Bangladesh. Now, each group, investigators as well as performers, determine the region of investigation, the course of the river along which its tributaries, etc., and then acquire primary knowledge of the community, secondary through primary and secondary sources, strands of history, society, economics, culture, politics, and also break up into smaller groups to study sub-region, visit respective sub-regions, and importantly, hold meetings with communities. Explain their objectives, reasons, and method of their devising process. With a consensus, when a consensus is reached with these people, the stakeholders and these creators, together, the first phase of the devising performance may commence, and only then you can begin in separately across the border for the two communities. The investigators and the performers should engage with the community members, the bearers of popular knowledge and wisdom, in an act of experiential knowing. The engagers need to know what these people, how these people symbolically construct their community, and how the construction is a state of becoming. It's not fixed, it's constantly moving and is in a state of flux. Objective of the investigation should be experientially apprehend the symbolic construction of the community in the minds of the community members, embedded in their thoughts, language, and the strands of history, society, and economics, and uncover how they communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge and attitude towards life on the question of the river. The investigators and the performers then seek to learn experientially by observing, informally conversing, as well as participating in cultural, economic, political life of the community across the border separately. Learning and recording these journals in terms of thick description by providing cultural context and meaning that the people are used when they're acting. Each group of investigators, performers, as well as the community members should periodically also engage in dialogic encounter to cross-check notes to see if they're on the same page or where they differ in their understandings. These meetings culminate in identifying situations that generate conflict with the antagonistic community. In Bangladesh, what are the issues? What are the situations that generate conflict with the people across the border? And the same with India. And having thus generated experiential knowledge and also, you know, the conflict, the main areas of conflict, performers devise. Now here the performers move in primarily to devise a performance that weaves together all these in a story, which ends up by posing a problem, not posing a solution, but it poses a problem. How the antagonist communities' claim to the river will mean this home communities' deprivation and even their extinction. So in Bangladesh, they pose a play which shows that how Indians or people across the border, their claim to the river will mean deprivation and extinction here. And at the same time, across the border, they should also devise a performance that should focus on the same question. The story is to reveal strands of history, society, economics, culture that are intertwined with the community's life of the river and generates empathy even among the others. Story should, so when performed across, it should really generate empathy. Like I said earlier, when Sare Jahan Se Acha, when Pak Sar Zameen and Indian national song, national anthem are sung across the border. So it is in there you generate empathy among the other. In that manner, if you can generate empathy, place spectators in borderless space of null identity, where each eye can engage profoundly with each other and responses flow from both sides. This is what the story should do that the performers devise. And then each spectator should comprehend that there is no victory, but only victories that also generate warnings. The victories are really finally warnings. Investigators and performers agree that the devised piece represent a valid statement regarding the community's claim to the river. They should present it to the investigators and performers. They should present it also to the stakeholders, and they should all agree that yes, they validly presents their case and valid problem produced by the counterclaim of the antagonist community, and the performance is presented to the entire community in order to generate dialogue. Still here on each side of the border, they have not traveled across the border, but the performance now should be presented to the entire community, and now dialogue should be generated on the issue of the question posed by the performance. And it is then that this play is further amended based on suggestions made by the community members, and then each of the two performances are presented to the antagonistic community. So performance from Bangladesh goes to India, and performance from India comes to Bangladesh. And then the performers, accompanied by investigators, engage in a dialogic encounter with the antagonist community's case. By firstly performing the core piece, and then inviting the members of the antagonist community to propose solutions to the problem posed by the antagonist community. And then the performers produce each of the solutions suggested, and at the end, produce a piece that generates a new problem which requires fresh intervention from the spectators to solve it. So if there is a solution from India based on the case made from Bangladesh, that this is how it could be solved, then they could perform it and to see how it would create perhaps new problems and how that could be solved. At the end, when all the suggestions are dialogue, the performers are to go back to their respective communities, present all the suggestions made by the antagonistic communities. And this phase is to end at a point where consensus can be reached as to which solutions are acceptable. So which of the Indian solutions are acceptable in Bangladesh to community members, and which of the Bangladeshi solutions are acceptable across the border. With the suggested solutions from both the communities, the two groups of performers and investigators are to meet and share this time. Now, for the first time, they meet and share their findings, and the two groups should devise a synthesized piece that incorporates the two core performances and a range of suggested solutions proposed. The synthesized piece is not to suggest a final solution, but it should present two problems of the two antagonist communities dialectically, ending with multiple options for problem that generate notion of the community and superseding, importantly, it's superseding the notion of the nation. When this is ready, the synthesized piece is to be presented at festive gathering of both the community. Ideally in a place in somewhere near the border where people from both the communities, both the sides of the border can come and see the performance, and here for the first time maybe state level policy planners and administrators can be present. This is what I need to, what I have to say, and this is my proposal, and perhaps you can carry on from here.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Jamil, for that wonderful proposal. And it's, I think there's a lot to be done moving ahead. And thank you to Professor Bisht. I can't but help sharing a thought with you on my closing is that, you know, we are, I think, living in very eventful times. For example, in the India-Bangladesh context, for the first time since many decades, I think ships have now started plying across the border on our rivers, and the inland waterways are going to be revived. There is a lot of enthusiasm on that, and I think we should take that. We could take that as how the communities along these revived waterways can benefit from benefit at so many levels. Maybe in addition to the troublesome areas, we could also think of dialogic performances where you talked about, where how this newly found connectivity through the river, as we call it, can be used to build narratives of communities talking to each other, how those symbols can be invoked, what can be done in the future for the prosperity, for the livelihoods of people at the regions, at the borders, and across both sides of the border. So that's just a thought I had, passing thought that I thought I would share with you, before we finally conclude. Any comments on that, Professor Jamil, particularly?
Well, as long as the nation and the state, they don't intervene, as long as it is really, I mean, people to people, we can sort out our differences. It is not too complicated. It is not. And as long as you understand the other, I mean, and it is here, of course, I strongly believe that cultural tools facilitate communication, understanding, dialogue, and understanding the other. It symbolically reconstructs your community, notion of the community, to encompass the other, to embrace the other. And that's what is important finally, because we need to live, we need the state to make sure that we can work properly, and the state can go its way, and we can, as long as we can work peacefully. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, I mean, in the Professor Bisht, I mean, on my closing thought, and what Professor Jamil said, I think on these areas, I was just Googling through the latest agreements or the latest announcements that have made the headlines in respect to cooperation between, say, India and Bangladesh in the last few weeks. And it's all about connectivity through the rivers, actually. So the state has been very enthusiastic. I think it has to be met bottom up now by the community. So that is, I see a little light at the end of the tunnel there also. I mean, on that hopeful note, if you like to say a final remark on that before we finally conclude? Dr.
Thank
Bisht.
you so much. I mean, thank you so much, for having us here. And I think I personally benefited from this conversation a lot. On connectivity, and this question keeps on coming back to me. While you, as you put it, we're indeed staying in very interesting times where we're talking about physical connectivity, and my only, I would say, humble submission, to the policymakers, would be that while it's very good to talk about physical connectivity, I think in South Asia, we also need to talk about the mental connectivity. We need to talk about the psychological connectivity. And only then I think South Asia will be really integrated. And we can, in fact, transit, say, from the collectivity of states to a community of states. And I think that's very, very essential. And this is going to be beneficial, I would say, not only to individual South Asian countries, to the people on the ground, but also to the foreign policy, to the long-term strategy which the countries have in the region. On that, I do hope that if connectivity at all happens, it really happens in holistic terms. Because again, going back to South Asian traditions, I think, what our philosophers have told us is to really look at things not in partial ways, but in holistic terms and integrated terms. And I think on that note, yes, this is what I have to say.
Thank you. And I think that is exactly the point of these discussions. That is also the purpose of the Asian Confluence, and the name behind it, and the spirit of the name, and the spirit behind the name, which is to bridge or really have a confluence of ideas, and to connect the hearts of people, and the mental connectivity, as you said. And this discussion, I think, bridging the disciplines of culture and diplomacy, and bridging the borders of nations, and we are friends, and we will continue to work together, I'm sure. And that's the kind of things that we need to move forward. And on that note, I think these conversations do try to, on various platforms, do try to bridge that connectivity, the mental connectivity and the psychological connectivity and the bonding of hearts. As Lalon said, water, it's everywhere, whether it's in a river or it's in the marsh, so wonderfully put. So thank you again. I have been personally very, very enriched by this conversation today, and thank you to Professor Jamil. Thank you, Dr. Bisht, so much for your time. And let's continue this conversation in online, and hopefully in the future offline and at the borders, as you proposed.
Yes. Absolutely. Look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you, Professor Ahmed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bisht. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.